Al Gore gave a talk on the change in climate at a conference given by the Folk Alliance. It all came down in Kansas City, Mo. I'm going to rap it to you now. Can you hear me? Yo! Folk Alliance is an international association of folk musicians, singer-songwriters, folkies, we call ourselves. Al Gore updated his 2006 film, An Inconvenient Truth, with new slides and video. Well, they were a sad parade of catastrophic climate events taking place across the globe. He ended his talk on a higher note. You see, Pete Seeger had passed away just a month before. So Gore urged all us folkies to go out there and write songs that told the truth about environmental change and spread them all over this land, which is a reference to a song by Pete Seeger, the Hammer Song, or sometimes called If I Had a Hammer. And I'm sure we all remember the way Peter, Paul, and Mary sang it. If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out a warning, I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Gore projected a photo montage of Pete on the screen as we rose to our feet with a roar, and Gore called out over the din, "Pete Seeger, God rest his soul." I flew home the next morning on Southwest, grabbing the middle seat of the first row. There's a little bit more legroom there. I shook and howdied with the woman on my right, and I turned to the guy on my left, mid-60s, a bigger guy than I, and said, "Well, were you at Folk Alliance?" Everyone on the plane had been at Folk Alliance. He says, "Yes, I was." "And what were you doing there?" "I was giving a talk with slides and video." "Oh, you're former Vice President Al Gore." "Yes, I am. Thank you for your work on behalf of the environment." "You're welcome." Gore was busy on this flight. Before liftoff, he peeled open his Apple laptop. Did you know Gore sits on Apple's board of directors and surfed the internet? When we took off, he bagged the Apple, opened the New York Times book review section, and read it cover to cover. I try not to take the time of famous people when I find I'm in their presence, especially famous busy people, so I let them be. I took a nap, and when I woke up, a stroll up and down the aisle. As we were coming back in for a landing, I sat back down, buckled up, and asked Gore what kind of music his father, Al Gore Sr., a fiddle player, had played. "Oh, mostly country and bluegrass." "I see, and when he came in from the road, did he have stories to tell?" "Well, he had some stories that he told, but he was not really a storyteller." Are you a storyteller?" I tell stories about playing bass with Peter, Paul, and Mary, Jerry Garcia, Bill Monroe, and most recently a story about longtime family friend Pete Seeger. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you very much. It was a loss for all mankind. He was an incredible human being." Gore nodded in apparent agreement. Our plane touched down to a smooth landing, and as we taxied to the jetway, I told Al Gore my Pete Seeger story. Central to Pete's ideology was peace. And the path to peace Pete preached was by getting adversaries to just sit down and start talking with each other. So, on April 30th, 2008, my wife and I ferried to San Francisco's Embarcadero to witness the unveiling of a monument dedicated to the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Oh, this is the Spanish Civil War. Yes, it was, 1936 to 1939. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade was the 3,200 Americans who went to Spain and volunteered to fight in defense of the legally elected Spanish Republic against a military coup led by General Francisco Franco and aided and abetted by the armies and the air forces of Hitler and Mussolini. Of the 3,200 that went and fought, only 39 lived on that April day. So to have 11 of them together at the unveiling felt like a record, but also like the end of an era. The MC introduced the veterans to warm applause, and then he introduced the officials who had gathered. First, he introduced San Francisco's mayor. I would imagine you know Gavin Newsom. Oh, sure, I know Gavin. Fine guy. And then he introduced San Francisco's chief protocol officer, Charlotte Schultz. And finally, he introduced Charlotte's husband, George Schultz. Now, George is a good man, and he's on the right side with the environment. Yeah, well, maybe so. But this crowd, when the MC introduced him, this crowd broke out into a long, loud, and heartfelt chorus of boos! He didn't deserve that. You know, maybe not, Mr. Gore, but this group is as far off to the left as Schultz is to the right. You know, I played a party at his house recently where I heard him proudly proclaim, I backed Schwarzenegger for Sacramento and Bush for the White House, and it's always nice to back winners. And Gore says, Schultz backed Bush for the White House? Oh, yes. W or HW? Oh, W. I didn't know that. Was he saying that he didn't know that this good man, Schultz, had backed Bush in Bush's defeat of Gore in the 2000 presidential election? So I continued. As the booing was about to die down, we heard from the back of the crowd a man's voice calling out loudly and clearly, "Murderer!" Oh, that was wrong. That was plain wrong. And 15 minutes later, Mr. Gore, when Newsom was speechifying, he turned to us and he said, you know, only in San Francisco could this monument have been erected. And we all agreed with that. And only in San Francisco can we disagree. And here he looked right at the guy who had called Schultz a murderer without being disagreeable. And we all agreed with that, too. You know, it had been the only downbeat in an otherwise up day. My wife and I ferried home later that evening when the ceremony had ended, where I wrote up the event as a 3-page story and sent it to some family members and to Pete Seeger. 3 days later, the phone rang. Hello. It was God calling. His age-wobbled voice rang out, "Hello, this is Pete Seeger." Although Pete had played music in my father's house many times, this was the first time he had phoned me. I sat down immediately. Pete was calling to say thank you for my having sent him the story about the unveiling. It was an event he would have loved to have attended. And then he turned the topic. Pete said, if I had been there when that guy had called Schultz a murderer, our plane docked at the jetway, interrupting my story. Gore stood up to help a woman offload her baggage from the bin above. But he sat back down again and he looked at me. So I continued. Pete said, if I had been there when that guy had called Schultz a murderer, I'd have walked right over to him. Gore stood up again to help another woman offload her baggage. She thanked him for his work on behalf of the environment. I guess he gets that a lot. He said, you're welcome. And me, I was losing my audience. But Gore sat back down again. He looked at me and he said, if I had been there when that guy had called Schultz a murderer, I'd have walked right over to him. Oh man, he had been listening. Pete said, I'd have walked right over to him. I'd have looked him right in the eyes and I would have said, we're all murderers. What we gotta do is sit down and start talking about our differences. Gore stood up to leave. He turned back to me. He said, Pete said that? Yes, he did. Mr. Gore, my apologies for taking your time. He brushed that off, stepped into the front entryway. They opened the front hatch for him. Al Gore exited. They closed the hatch after him. And 2 minutes later, they let the rest of us deplane. You know, I did feel badly about bending Gore's ear. But I was hoping that if I told him Pete Seeger's story, that he might tell it in turn to the heads of state and the captains of industry that he met as he traveled around. And now that you've heard Pete Seeger's story, I hope you tell it to the people you meet as you travel around. And maybe together, Al Gore, you, me, we can spread Pete Seeger's story and Pete Seeger's song. Now I've got a hammer, and I've got a bell, and I've got a song to sing all over this land. It's the hammer of justice, it's the bell of freedom, it's the song about love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. Ooh. I think Pete would like that very much. Thank you, Pete Seeger, for all you did. And thank you, one and all.